Councilman Khalid.
Right.
But no, my last name is Yoruba.
Ah.
So,
Okay.
yes.
So, take it your father's Nigerian.
No, I
Huh.
decided when I was 18 that I wanted to have an African name. I actually decided when I was 16,
Okay.
and I asked my parents,
Okay.
if I could change my name, and they said, "When you're 18, you could do whatever you want."
Okay.
So when I turned 18, I went down to the law library at Fulton County, met some nice ladies behind the desk, and they helped me go through the whole process.
Mhm.
And I changed my name that day. And I've
Okay.
always been Khalid Kamau as an adult.
Okay. A lot of people may not know that you went to law school. What type
Yes.
of attorney did you want to be when you were in school?
Um, I wasn't really sure. It was kind of a last minute. People have been saying for a while you should go to law school. Uh, I had applied. I had started a pre-law program in New York. Then I came back to Atlanta, and I was just kind of between jobs. And I was like, I'm going to take the LSAT again. So I took it. I went to school. I originally thought that I wanted to be a public defender.
Mhm.
Then I began to understand that the this was around the time the Black Lives Matter movement was starting, and I began to understand that the solicitors actually had um, more power in sentencing and determining sentences for folks. I really thought that I would be ultimately a civil rights attorney. I was really inspired by the attorneys in New Orleans who held police accountable, who shot people going over the bridge into, I think it was Medier, Louisiana. Um, and just there was a group of civil rights attorneys that there was a group of atrocities that happened to African Americans in New Orleans who were trying to escape, who were trying to just survive that storm. And there was a group of civil rights attorneys that held officers accountable, and I was like, I want to do that. Unfortunately, I went to a school that is very expensive, and when I began to understand that I would graduate with over
Oh
$200,000
wow.
in debt, right, and that my starting salary as a solicitor would be somewhere around $40,000, I was
Okay.
like, I make $40,000
Right.
now.
Right.
So hopefully I might go back someday, but at that point I left. I thought it wasn't a good decision. But the year that I have done really, like so many other things, all things work together. It really prepared me for the work that I'm doing now as a councilman. I read lots of legislation, ordinances. We have contracts with everyone from Comcast to subcontractors that we use to provide services for our city. So contracts was my favorite class. I had an amazing teacher,
Okay.
and so glad I did that.
Okay. Let's go back to your Black Lives Matter activist days, and I'm assuming you still do that. Maybe not as much. Kind of clarify, I guess, the different organizations with Black Lives Matter. I know one person incorporated, and I saw where you said that it wasn't incorporated. Are there chapters? Are there founders? Do you know the founders? Um, is it incorporated?
No, it's not incorporated. So
Okay.
Black Lives Matter, the founders are three amazing women: Alicia
Okay.
Garza, Opal Tometi, Patrice Cullors, yes,
Yes.
Patrice Cullors, Opal
Okay.
Tometi, and
Okay.
Alicia
Okay.
Garza. Um, so three radical, brilliant black women in uh, California and New York. It started with a letter. I believe Alicia Garza wrote it after the murder of Trayvon Martin, and she ended the letter with the words, "Black people, I love you. Our lives matter."
Okay. That's
And
how it started.
right, and then
Okay.
Patrice changed the hashtag to Black Lives Matter.
Mm.
Uh, it's it's really a brilliant concept. I think one of the things that people miss is the concept behind Black Lives Matter.
Mhm.
So there have always since slavery, there have always been lynchings of black people. Many people don't know that the police as a department started as a fugitive slave department, right? And so that was their initial job. Police have always, their jobs have always centered around protecting property. And at one point, black people were property.
That's correct.
And so the many police and sheriff's departments were founded to pursue runaway property. But since those times, right, there's been lynchings, there've been killings, there's been violence against black bodies perpetrated by the state at the hands of the police. And those stories weren't necessarily being told all of the time. So using this hashtag was a way to collect all of these stories of black violence. So now when you put in Black Lives Matter, you could find all of these stories of violence against black bodies, and you could also find all the people that were organizing against it. So it was a really great organizing tool where mainstream media didn't want to tell the stories, of the organizing and the things that were happening. This created a way for any young person to just go on their Twitter or their Facebook feed, and if they wanted to know where police violence was happening or where people were organizing against police violence, they could just put in that hashtag, and they weren't relying on some corporate media outlet to tell our stories. So that's one part of Black Lives Matter that was brilliant. The second part was there were some things that the founders and the early organizers did to try and counteract some of the destructive forces that came against previous civil rights movements. So we know, for example, not only the Black Panthers, but there were organizations in Philadelphia that were bombed. So once you incorporated, once you had a headquarters, people knew where you were, and they could bomb your office. Once you had a leader, they could assassinate your leader. We saw that happen with several of our leaders in the civil rights movement. So one of the goals was to make a movement that was so diffuse that you couldn't, cut off the head and scatter the movement. So we like to say that we're not leaderless, we're leaderful. There are tons of leaders, and you could kill me, you could kill Mary Hooks, who was the convener in Atlanta, and that group would still persist because we don't have this hierarchical structure. And we do have chapters. The name wasn't trademarked or copyrighted, so anyone technically can start a chapter, but there are chapters that are recognized by the founders and the founding groups and chapters. So there's a coalition of those. So every Black Lives Matter chapter you hear might not be connected, which is why some crazy things happen. And it's that's the trade-off, because we haven't maintained this tight control over the name. There are people who use that name in inappropriate ways, or ways that are contrary to the principles that are outlined at blacklivesmatter.com. Anybody can go to blacklivesmatter.com, read those principles. So yeah, that's the story behind that. But I got involved when the Atlanta meeting was convened shortly after the murder of Michael Brown. I just assumed, because I think that was maybe 2 years after Trayvon Martin, I just assumed that there was a Black Lives Matter Atlanta somewhere. And when I realized that there wasn't and they were starting, I was like, I got to be at that meeting. So from that very first meeting through probably the first year of its existence, I was at every meeting. I was really involved in the political education department. So there are all of these different departments, and I was most interested in changing policy and in explaining and learning with folks, because I don't have all the answers either, but learning with folks how policies were created, how they are enacted, and how we can change them. And all of that, had to do with political education, which dovetailed into what I do now.
Okay. I don't know if you know, but I did run for city council. I'm speaking, I guess, prophetically about Greenhaven. But I ran for county commissioner in DeKalb County. And as a Bernie Sanders delegate, I incorporated part of his platform into mine because that's something that he wanted us to do. And I added the two most popular, decriminalization of marijuana and raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Was that part of your platform, or is that something that you want to do with the city of Renaissance, Georgia?
Absolutely. People will say, "Oh, there." Some of my critics from outside of this district. So I'm from Onat, right? Some critics outside of this district are like, "Oh, you're pushing a Black Lives Matter platform." I absolutely am pushing a Black Lives Matter platform.
Okay.
When I ran, my business cards, and still to this day, the business cards I use say Black Lives Matter activist on them. So everyone knew what I was. Everyone knew what I believed. I always talked about Black Lives Matter. Everyone knew that I ran for Bernie Sanders. Interestingly enough, that was the very first political campaign that I ever volunteered for.
Really?
Yes. And
wow.
And in an amazing twist of fate, I did not know that the city of Renaissance, as we are now named, was even being contemplated at the time. I was focused more on national politics, statewide politics, and city of Atlanta politics, because that city existed, and that is where a lot of Black Lives Matter meetings were held. So we really focused on changing policy in Atlanta. But the very first doors that I ever knocked were in my neighborhood for Bernie Sanders. I went to, I think it's pretty well documented now that though Bernie Sanders had a few black folks in leadership in the campaign, they weren't really listened to the way that they probably should have been. And I knew that there was no one on this side of town that was talking about Bernie Sanders. And when you looked at his platform, when I looked at the people I knew on Old Nat, I was like, this is what people on Old Nat believe in. We believe in the decriminalization of marijuana. We believe in raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We believe that everyone should have access to affordable housing and affordable health care. So I went to the office and I was like, you guys are not, there are no Bernie signs, there's no presence on Old National. And they were like, you can take some signs and get a group together and go out and start knocking. And that is what I did. And interestingly enough, when I did it, I was really good at it. You know, I should probably feign modesty, but I was really good at it.
I'm sure you were good at it.
And someone said, have you ever thought about running for office? And I was like, nah, I'm not. There's too much phoniness, and then you got to raise money and do all this stuff. I was like, I'm not interested in that. I just wanted to do political education for the people. But 3 or 4 months later, I was knocking doors again as a candidate for delegate. And then a year later, I knocked those same doors as a candidate for office. So by the time I was running for office, people had seen me twice at their doors already.
Okay, so that worked out well for you.
Yes, all things work together.
Yes, they do. Okay, 2020. Bernie Sanders, do you think he should or will run again? And if he does, will you support him?
If he runs, I will absolutely support him.
Okay.
He is incredible. I got to meet him at the Carter Center.
What was that like?
It was so amazing. They told me at the last minute. I knew that he would be there, but they told I just won election. I was the first Our Revolution endorsed candidate to win election in Georgia.
I didn't know that. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay.
And so I guess as a reward, they sat me at his table. I actually sat next to him and Jimmy Carter. So I was like, oh, you know. But Bernie, when Bernie came in, we were eating like salad or something. We were eating some first course.
Right.
He pushed the plate aside. He was like, tell me about South Fulton. And he's like, he started asking me about like the tax structure, we really started talking policy right there at the table. That man is focused. He is the real deal. He's not just someone that just makes flowery speeches. He really gets into the policy, like how can we make this happen?
But don't you think he knew something about you or heard about you after all the protests that you initiated at the convention? I still have my no TPP shirt. That you passed out.
I don't know that he knew about that, but I was in contact with Our Revolution folks, and so what he did talk to me about, he was like, "You're quite the politician," because there's this probably my most famous Instagram picture is me cutting a woman's grass. So I was knocking doors trying to talk about my campaign, and she was like, I want to see you cut this grass if you want me to listen to you. So I did. I cut her grass. I remember that John Lewis, when he was first running, and he's one of my heroes, he's one of my idols. And I remember that he did that. And the young lady that was knocking doors with me, she snapped a photo of it. It's got like thousands of likes on Instagram. He was like, I saw that photo of you cutting grass on Instagram. He was like, you're quite the politician. So yeah, he had heard of that. But yeah, it was amazing. I definitely would endorse him. I also, though, think that we have to be looking for the next generation of leaders. We have to look for new leaders. I think that one of the things that made President Obama's run so revolutionary was that he brought an entirely new demographic of folks.
He did.
You know, first as an African American, and then second as, you know, a young president. I know people to this day that is the only time they have ever voted for anyone. And like, I mean, that's not great, but we need people like that who can bring in new folks. And to some extent, Bernie did that as well. So.
Last Tuesday, we made history in this country where we had all these women get elected. The non-traditional white male, if you will, get elected. Do you think that the state of Georgia can bring that passion and drive here and possibly elect the first African American governor, even the first female governor? Do you think Georgia's ready?
Georgia's definitely ready. We made history last Tuesday as well. Duluth elected their first African American. That was a campaign I worked on.
I didn't know that.
His name was Kirkland Carden.
Okay.
Duluth is the most diverse city in the most diverse county in the state, but its city council
More so than DeKalb?
More so than DeKalb.
I did not
Gwinnett
know
is
that.
the most diverse county in the
Gwinnett.
state.
Yes. Okay.
And Duluth is the most diverse county, most diverse city in that county.
Okay.
But to date, their city council was all white. Their county commission is all white. So they elected their first African American, 29-year-old named Kirkland Carden.
Okay.
In the city of Doraville, they elected the first transgender person in Georgia.
Wow. Okay.
She's elected to city council. So you see these things happening. I think the Democratic establishment has to acknowledge that this is a party of black and brown folks. It's a party of black and brown and young folks. And our leadership from top to bottom has to represent that so that we can turn them out.
Well, do you think that's probably why it may be hard for a Democrat to win in Georgia? Because that's pretty much how Republicans paint the Democratic Party.
No, I think we should not run away from that. That is our strength.
Okay.
First of all, there are more registered Democrats in Georgia than there are Republicans. So there's absolutely no reason that we should not have a Democratic mayor. There's a lot of gerrymandering going on in terms of how our districts are constructed. But in an at-large election like the governor, it doesn't matter what district you live in.
Right.
If every Democrat just shows up to vote, we will have a Democratic mayor.
Okay.
And if most of those Democrats, or a large part of them, are black and brown people, what we know about voting is that African American women have the highest voting demographic.
That's true.
In America. Like,
That's
not
true.
just more than African American men. They vote more than anyone else. And when they vote overwhelmingly Democrat,
Okay.
80%. So when the base of your party is black and brown women, then the leadership of your party should look like your base. And perhaps when we start doing that, we'll start winning more.
Okay. So then do you think possibly the Democratic Party could run and help elect the first African American woman president?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I believe the first African American woman president will come from the party, and I think that we should be working on that.
Okay. Are you a Democrat or a Democratic Nationalist Socialist?
I'm a Democratic Socialist.
Okay.
I'm
So it's
absolutely
Democratic
Socialist,
Socialist. Okay.
yes.
Okay. what attracted me to Bernie Sanders was the idea of free education. I'm a 29-year veteran school teacher, and so of course education is important to me. When he talked about using money or taxpayers' money to open up schools instead of incarcerate African Americans, he talked about how the United States locks up 25% of our people are in jail, and no other Western country, I don't think any other country in the world does that. And I know that you had an education summit last Saturday.
Yes.
Could you tell me about that, and if whether or not Renaissance is going to have its own school system, and is there any type of political curriculum that you would like to see implemented in the new school system?
So Renaissance will not have its own school system.
Okay.
We're actually barred by the state code of Georgia from having our own school system. It's really hard to start your own school system.
Okay.
But what we can do as a city is support the schools within our city limits. And Fulton County actually has a charter system. So we have more latitude in influencing the curriculum and the days. And so as a community, one of my goals is to see us support our schools, the schools that are in our city limits, more strongly. But what we did, one of my first initiative, really my first big initiative, was to try and make Election Day a holiday. We actually took a vote and we became the first city. So Clarkston has a half day. We became the first city to make.
Congratulations.
But the mayor vetoed it.
So why?
We became the first city. The mayor vetoed it. You'd have to ask the mayor why he vetoed it.
And I think I read he said something about it would hurt businesses or something if
No, because Georgia has these preemption laws thanks to the American Legislative Exchange Council. Everyone look up ALEC. They are the evil empire.
Yes, they are. That's why I work for state school superintendent. But anyway,
we are not allowed to tell businesses when to open or close. All we could do was close the city, for employees. But the goal was not really to. If you think about the King Day, it has become not a day off, but a day on. Right? It's a day of service.
Right.
So we wanted Election Day to become a day of political education, the way that it is in Puerto Rico. People take the entire day off. They go through ballots together. Families, they actually go out and vote together. Then they sit down and have dinner. So there's an entire culture of voting.
So it's almost like a holiday that's celebrated.
It is a holiday that's celebrated, right? So the same way that we have all of this fervor around Black Friday and everybody's taking off and lining up, we wanted to create that same sort of excitement around voting. And one of the things that I learned in this race was that people don't vote because they don't care. They just don't know how it works. We spend a lot of time focusing on national elections. Even now, I could go into any barbershop and people could tell me about Trump and what they feel about Trump, but they can't tell me who their county commissioner is. And that's not necessarily the fault of the people, but our news stations don't report on the county commission. They don't report on our city council. I've really struggled with the news media trying to get them to come out. We named a brand new city tonight. No major news outlet was there. There was a house that was shot up in a drive-by last week, and every news station covered it. Right. And so the people who run those news stations don't look like you and I. They've decided that they've created in their head a narrative about what our neighborhoods are like, and they send reporters out to reinforce that narrative. And so it's really important, again, as a Black Lives Matter activist, I think that's one of the reasons it's important to have our own media and to tell our own story. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for coming.
But so yes, that day of political education, we will do that every year. And
I attended that actually.
You did?
Yes, because I had to corner you to make sure you would be here today.
I was running around all over. It was a blur.
And when you see the article I wrote, I talked about that. But I did come to the part where you had the two Stacys come to speak during your town hall.
Yes.
And talk a little bit more about that. It was a 12-hour event.
It was a 12-hour event. We had two we had both Democratic candidates for governor, the candidates for Fulton County chair, and the candidates for state senate, the 39th district. No major news outlet covered it. We had two Democratic candidates for governor who have, and no candidate for governor has ever come to Old National. So I was so proud of that achievement. I went everywhere telling everyone about it. But it's just an example of how the media does not really cover local politics, and that is where individuals can make the biggest change in their community. It's not SEC regulations that make Old National what it is. It's the allocation of funds for police and fire and parks and recs and schools, and that's where we really need to be spending our energy as a community.
I think they cover the news. Living in DeKalb County, we get covered all the time, but in a negative light.
Right.
There's nothing ever said positive about DeKalb County.
So
there have been times when I've watched the news and there have been 3 or 4 stories back to back that has something negative to do with DeKalb. But during your electoral college is what you called it, right?
Yes.
Did you offer any classes? What are any sessions or?
Oh yeah, there was a day long of classes. So we had so we covered the things that people want to know about how their government works, right? People don't care about our trade deficit with China. Like, I mean, people on national, they care about
politics are local.
But what they care about is how you get speed bumps on your street, right? So we had people from Fulton County's Public Works Department come out and explain the process of how you get speed bumps, how you pay for them, how the traffic studies work. And we had classes like, I'm trying to think of another one that was really popular. Of course, that we were at that time we were going through the naming of our city, so that was a very popular class.
Did Renaissance win?
Renaissance did win. We are the city. I mean
at your session.
At our session, we talked less about what the name should be, because people had been doing that a lot, and it was more of a visioning session about economic development. What is because I think a lot of the anxiety about what our name would be was really a proxy for the anxiety of what kind of city we were going to be. So instead of having the surface conversation, we had the real conversation about how big do you want the city to become? What is our plan for mass transit? Do you believe in mass transit? Because, a lot of people have moved out here to get away from mass transit, to get away from high density housing. So we had to talk about those sorts of things. We also talked about how bills become a law in the state legislature and how the state legislature is organized.
That's great.
How to lobby for changes that you want made. And so just a lot of those real meat and potatoes things. We had someone, so the weekend after that, we had another event called Save Our Schools. I do a lot of these events with Councilman Mark Baker, who is in the district next to me. And in that one, we talked about what is a school governance council? Many people don't know that you don't have to have a child in the school to participate in the PTA. I didn't know that. I would drive past schools all the time and think, I have no business being in there. I don't have any kids there. So we talked about how that wasn't true, how you could get involved in your schools, how the school governance council works, how the school board works. If you want to make this kind of change, this is where you go. A lot of many of our schools have been labeled as failing, and our teachers have worked very hard. So there is now no high school in Renaissance that is a failing high school. All of our high schools are off the failing list.
That's great.
It is. And so we had principals talk about how we got our schools off the failing list and how to keep those things going up. A lot of people don't understand the mechanics behind where those letter grades come from. That it's not just standardized tests, right? But things like how often kids are late to school, whether or not parents fill out a survey that's sent home, little things that you would never think about.
Attending parent-teacher conferences.
Right. Affect the letter grade of a school. So we talked about, and that is just my whole next 4 years as a councilman are going to be about making sure that people understand how their government works. Because once people know and they feel empowered, they become more engaged.
Okay. You've said a lot of interesting things. I guess I'm going to kind of take the shift a little bit away from Renaissance, formerly known as South Fulton, and talk a little bit about Greenhaven. Are you familiar with the initiative to incorporate the remainder of South DeKalb into the city of Greenhaven?
I have not
Okay.
heard that. I knew people that wanted to talk about it. I didn't know that it had a name.
Yes.
I will say I've been talking to people in South DeKalb about that.
Okay.
We voted no to become in 2006. There was a referendum for us to become a
But
city.
you got a referendum. We can't get one. That's the problem.
No. What I was going to say is,
Okay.
we had a referendum, but we still voted no.
Okay.
And when we voted no, Sandy Springs, Johns Creek, and
Mm-hmm.
Milton became cities,
Mm-hmm.
and Chattahoochee Hills,
Mm-hmm.
and that left only South Fulton as unincorporated.
Right.
And that might have been fine, except that all of the surrounding cities began to annex our most valuable
Thank you.
areas.
Thank you. Say it again, please.
All of the surrounding cities began.
Yes.
So, for example, on Buffington Road, just around the corner from here, is Chick-fil-A's headquarters.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
It's the national headquarters for
I
Chick-fil-A.
did not know that.
It would have been in our city had we incorporated in 2006, but when we didn't, Union City took that and all of the businesses on that strip,
Mm-hmm.
annexed those into Union City, and left just the neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what people don't understand is that businesses pay more taxes and they use less services. They don't call the fire, they don't call the police, right? They don't need public works because Chick-fil-A's campus, they have their own security, they pave their own roads. You know, it's its own little city, but they pay all of these tax dollars in, and so we were left with an ever decreasing tax base to pay for our police and our fire and our services. One of the reasons that our police response times have been so poor, and have become increasingly worse over the past several years, is because we have less and less of a tax base to pay for these services. But now that we're a city, we've stopped that hemorrhaging of our tax base, and we have local representatives that are going to. And so long or no shorter, what I've been telling people in South DeKalb is, you better become a part of either a city that's next to you, or you better form your own city.
Right.
While you still have some choice in the
Right.
matter, because when La Vista Hills and
Yes.
Emory Village and all of these
Yes,
places become
yes,
cities,
yes,
they're going to pull that money out of
yes,
DeKalb's tax
yes.
base. You know all of this.
I
so.
do, but it's just hard to get other people to understand it. But while listening to you, and as you talked about your electoral college, I think what may be a little different is that you're asking people what they want instead of telling them what they should have. And I
Well-
think when people buy in to the vision and how they can take part of it, then it becomes their own, or they take ownership of the vision and want to see it happen.
Well, I'm going to tell you, the first few times that I knocked on doors as a candidate, after coming out of all of this political education with Black Lives Matter, I didn't knock on doors and say, vote for me. I knocked on doors with laminated maps of the city. Most people had never seen the city. They didn't know what the city limits were. They didn't
Okay.
know whether or not they were in the city. So myself and all of my volunteers went around with maps.
Okay.
And we also went around with frequently asked question sheets. Like, will my post office change? Are we going to have control over the schools? What about police? Do we have enough money to become a city? So I just spent the first, and it was a very short campaign. I think we had probably about 3 or 4 months. But I spent the first 2 months never talking about myself and just educating people. And I think that I won with the first election with the largest majority of anyone in any district.
Wow.
And it wasn't because I was such an amazing candidate. I think people just rewarded me for telling them about their city and about their neighborhood. And so I think that is what you all will have to do in Green, because there was a lot of misinformation and a lot of misconceptions. And so people had voted no because they just didn't really understand what was at stake and what would happen in that no vote. So this time around, with that political education, I think that you will get the response
Okay.
that you want. It also helps now if you have state representatives and senators who are going to
We
push
can't
that.
get that. We don't have the champion that you had.
Well,
Maybe-
it sounds like you'll be running for office again.
I don't think so. But that's what I was going to ask you. Will you be running again for higher office beyond what you have now?
You know, at this point, I am just focused on, and I know this sounds like such a politician's answer, but really, I have 4 years in this office. So I am focused on being the best representative for Old National. Old National has been neglected for 20 years. And I want to make sure that we're not ignored anymore. And if I ran for any other office, that will always be my focus, because this is my home.
Okay. City of Atlanta. Who do you hope or who do you think will win that race? Or do you have a
There's
favorite candidate?
My favorite candidate was Vincent Ford.
Of course.
You know, he was
Of course.
the Bernie delegate.
Right. he
I
was.
think unfortunately, and we were just having this conversation tonight. The Atlanta I am from was not a place, it was a time. Where we had 40 years of continuous black leadership, black mayors, starting with Maynard Jackson.
That's right.
We had a huge redistribution of wealth and an investment in minority-owned businesses that had
Yes,
been
we
locked
did.
out for generations.
That's right. Thanks to Maynard Jackson.
Thanks to Maynard Jackson,
Yes.
we had the National Black Arts Festival, and
Right.
we had Freaknik. You know,
Yes, it's true.
we have this new Atlanta that is on the verge of becoming not a majority African American city,
And that breaks my heart.
where the
That
average
breaks my heart.
where the average 2-bedroom I believe is like $1,500 to
Right.
$1,700 a month. You know, so it's a city that I can't afford to live in. It's not the Atlanta that is being created is not being created for me. So I thank God for Renaissance, that there is a place that is 90% African American and still affordable.
90%. I thought it was like
90%.
the high 80s. Green Haven will be a heavily populated African American city too, and a lot of people don't like it. Actually, I've spoken to a lot of African Americans who say they don't want to have or be led by African Americans, unfortunately. But
I just think, you know, as that goes back to the work that we do as Black Lives Matter. We've just got to teach our people all over again to believe. We have to believe in one another, and believe in what we can do. And the argument that I've made, because people make that argument about Renaissance, and you know, I say Atlanta was 70% African American, run by all these African Americans. It did
who
not
made
stop
the
us.
city what it is today?
Right. It did not stop us from having the world's busiest airport or bringing the Olympics. You know, it didn't stop any of those things from
Right.
happening. The Atlanta that exists today was made possible by 40 years of African American leadership.
Right.
And so we can do that again in the city of Renaissance, and we will.
Good. Glad to hear that. Okay. I'm so glad to interview you again. I noticed you at the convention. I noticed your personal power. I noticed how easy it was for you to move people to action. I'm sure you saw the movie Malcolm X.
Yes.
Do you remember that scene when I believe it's the Fruits of Islam were in front of the
He was
hospital?
outside the jailhouse, and he did the
And so you kind of have that.
I don't know about
Yeah,
that.
that's
I don't know about that.
type of power. But again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be on the Rita Robinzine show. I wish you well. If you need for me to do anything or attend anything, just let me know.
I want you to bring all the people from Greenwood out so that they can learn from Greenhaven. Greenwood is the city in Nebraska.
Okay.
Do you know about Greenwood?
I don't know about Greenwood.
Everyone should look it up. It was an
Okay.
African American city. It was very prosperous, and it was Tulsa. It was
What about
bombed.
Tulsa?
It was called Black Wall Street, and it was called Greenwood. So I thought Greenhaven was a
okay.
nod towards Greenwood.
Oh, that's a good idea.
But
There's a
have
plug.
the people that are interested in incorporating in South DeKalb, please have them come out and study us. Have them attend our meetings.
Okay.
We'd be happy to talk to them
Okay.
because we want to spread this independence and self-determination throughout all of Georgia.
Okay. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a very informative show tonight. Again, with
Councilman Khalid.
Khalid.
And I'm gonna do a plug. You can find out more about me and the City of Renaissance at khalidcares.com.
Okay. All right. This has been a Fanciful Films Entertainment Company production. Thank you and have a good night.